Okay. Chag Sameach. Thank you to Babayit and your representative Yifat for hosting.
It's a whole collaborative.
She helped
Condominium.
Yeah, so traditionally Hanukkah has been a time when Darshanim and Midrashim like to talk about the relationship between Torah and Greek wisdom and Greek culture and just more broadly anything outside of Judaism. And as we're going to get into, I want to focus on a couple of modern thinkers who look at that same kind of tension, one of them explicitly within the framework of Hanukkah. A little bit about who I am first. Know some of you I don't. Some of you sort of in the middle. My name is Levi Morrow. I'm originally from Los Angeles. I made Aliyah 5 years ago at this point. I studied at Oraita in the Old City after Yeshiva. I did my bachelor's degree at Herzog Academic College in Gush Etzion. Studied Tanakh and Jewish philosophy, where I became interested in Rav Shagar, an Israeli religious Zionist thinker, who we're going to see tonight. I'm right now doing my master's degree in Jewish philosophy at Tel Aviv University, and I'm working on my thesis on Rav Shagar's use of Franz Rosenzweig, who's the other thinker we're going to see tonight. I'm in Tel Aviv roughly 2 days a week. The rest of the time I do part-time work at the Shalom Hartman Institute, which is over in Talbia, not too far from here. One of the things I do there is I do some research assistant work for one of the teachers in their gap year program who's teaching a course on American Jewry. And I had this weird assignment this week, which was find details and lyrics for this set of like 6 or 7 Christmas songs written by Jews. So it turned out like all of the most famous Christmas songs in America are written by Jews.
It's always like a sense of pride where it's like, yeah, like we wrote them.
Right, so one of them, the White Christmas, was written by Irving Berlin, originally born Yisrael Balin, who also wrote America the Beautiful, I think it is, the Procida Shining Sea one, which is also a sense of pride thing, but also he was clearly trying to assimilate a little bit. And that got me sort of thinking a lot about this question of like, is there a clean line we can draw between Judaism and the outside world? And if so, where do we draw that line? So we're going to look at that first through Franz Rosenzweig. Franz Rosenzweig was born in 1886. He died in 1929. He lived in Germany, in a variety of places, wrote in German. Welcome, we're just getting started. I was saying the first thinker we're looking at tonight is Franz Rosenzweig, who was a Jew born in Kastel, Berlin, I believe, in 1886, to an essentially not quite assimilated family. It was sort of a lot of the Jewish community there was Jewish, but very much what you might call Yom Kippur Jews. They come to Shalom Yom Kippur and that's it. And by the time he was done with college, he was in the process of converting to Christianity. And then through a torturous series of arguments and discussions with friends, Jewish and Christian, and some of them who were Jews who had converted to Christianity, he eventually decided, no, he must remain a Jew. And after that has a lot of his really prolific writings about what it means to be Jewish, what the Jewish people are, and all from the perspective of a Jew who grew up assimilated in Germany. And he actually leads something of a renaissance of Jewish education in the sort of interwar period in Germany, which has a mixed legacy. Some of the teachers and students from there came to Israel or America and taught lots of students, and many of them unfortunately died because it was right before World War II. So I want to start looking. This is the first section here, which I've titled "The Weather Outside is Frightful," based on that intro about Christmas songs written by Jews. Is selections from a book review he wrote called Apologetic Thinking, where he talks about a couple of books written by Jews about like what is Judaism, what is Christianity, and he has this whole theory of like what it means to be Jewish and what it means to write books about what it means to be Jewish. And he sees those are two different things, that being Jewish and talking about Judaism, trying to define Judaism, aren't necessarily the same thing. And I'll just launch right into that with the first piece here. It says, Judaism indeed has dogmas, but no dogmatics. The community does not wish to be only a spiritual community, but wants rather to be what it actually is in contrast to other communities connected by spirit and intellect alone. It's a natural community, a people. Anyone want to take a guess at sort of what he's trying to get at there? And I'll say that he's writing a little confusingly, that's what he does, I'm sorry. It's what everyone did in Germany in the first half of the 20th century. Right, so he's basically creating a differentiation between what Judaism is, a community, a natural community of people, and what other groups are, which are spiritual communities. He says Judaism is not just a spiritual community, it's a natural community of people. So in contrast to, say, Christianity, or really any other religion you might define as a spiritual community, Judaism isn't first and foremost like a community based around shared beliefs and shared religious rituals and history and things. It's shared around little physical, just being a people. There are chairs in the corner over there.
There's also just one over here.
Right, much more covenant of fate as opposed to the covenant of destiny. So, in the first source here, Rosenzweig is saying that the Jewish people are not first and foremost bound together by their religion, just by being a people. He wrote a horrifically complex and impossible to understand book called The Star of Redemption. When he was writing it, he wrote a letter saying that he's worried it won't be hard enough to understand. But it has a phenomenal line. We have a bunch of really good lines. One is, I'm not going to bother with the original German, but it's, the bearing witness happens in the bearing forward, the having kids. That for what it means to be the Jewish people and to be or Lagoyim, and be God's people, is really, really bound up in just being a people. It's a lot less about having shuls and rituals and things that we normally think of as a religion. And he started off by saying Judaism has dogma but no dogmatics. That's part of it. We might have things that we believe, right? Anyone could tell you what are the things Jews believe, starting with the Torah and God and all, Mitzrayim, Har Sinai. But no, he's saying that it's not really Jewish to sit down and lay out how all of our theology and ideas all fit together in some big systematic sense. Everyone with me so far? Question? Okay. So he moves from there to talking about the Rambam. He thinks is a good example of this. And he first says what Rambam really thinks is his systematic work is the Mishnah Torah, his book of halachot, of laws, and that encompasses all of Judaism. If you want to know what all of Judaism is, it's what do you do and when. But Rambam wrote a big book of philosophy. So Rosenzweig is going to try and explain how that's not Rambam just trying to explain Judaism in a big, broad, systematic sense. How it's going to be what he calls apologetic thinking. Does anyone want to take a stab at reading number 2 here? Go for it.
The guide of the perplexed, however, will disappoint one who approaches it in the expectation of finding a system. The defense is directed against the attacks of philosophy, not or only peripherally against other religions, by which the defense could therefore have been taken over. The apologetic nature of the fundamental attitude yields the completely unpedantic character, which still today is a fresh breeze for the reader and strikes him as in no way scholastic. This thinking has what systematic thinking cannot have so easily, the fascination and the truthfulness of thought reacting to the occasion, but therefore a limit is also set for it which only systematic thinking removes, exactly the limit of the occasional. Only systematic thinking determines the circle of its object itself. Apologetic thinking remains dependent on the cause, the adversary.
So here, Rosenzweig contrasts the system and systematic thinking with apologetic thinking. Systematic thinking And this is actually what Rosenzweig tries to do in his like big book, is trying to make a system. So he's acknowledging that actually what he tried to do well before he wrote this letter was not really what Jews normally do. When Jews think about what Judaism is, they're always reacting to something, right? So Rambam is his example. Rambam wrote the Guide for the Perplexed explicitly for a student who has learned the Aristotelian philosophy of 12th century Arabic philosophers and knows the Torah and doesn't know how to put them together. Is that I believe both these things are true, but because I believe that philosophy is true, I can't possibly understand how the Torah could be true, because they just don't fit together at all. So Rambam is explicitly responding and formulating this whole complex understanding of what Torah is and what Judaism is and why God gave the Torah. And all of those things you'll find in the Guide for Perplexed. All of them in response to Aristotle and the Neo-Aristotelian thought of the time.
Are they like a disproof to Aristotle, or a way to?
No, he's reconciling them. He's going to reframe Judaism in a way that makes sense in context of Aristotle. I think one sharp and important point here is this point he makes, where he differentiates between systematic thinking and apologetic thinking, where he says that systematic thinking is scholastic and apologetic thinking is in no way scholastic. It's not a sort of intellectual exercise. It's always driven by the occasion, and systematic thinking removes exactly the limit of the occasional. That apologetic thinking is always stuck in a specific moment. So if we just said that Rambam's reframing Judaism so that it makes sense in context of 12th century philosophy, then when we get to the 20th century, it's a lot less helpful because it's still stuck in the 20th century. So what that's going to mean is that Rosenzweig also wants to talk about what's the Judaism that isn't stuck in the 20th century, right? If thinking in response to other people is how you get the Rambam, what is there that's not that in Judaism? Any questions so far? Great.
Wait, hold on. So
Yes.
he's saying, before he said Rambam is Judaism, stating like laws and explaining them, that's Judaism. But if you're explaining them in response to something else, then that's not Jewish?
So part of it is that the difference between laws and philosophy, right? So laws aren't an attempt to understand what Judaism is. They're to explain how you do Judaism, right? So laws are a guide for living Judaism, not a guide for thinking about Judaism. He says the only way you get a guide for thinking about Judaism is in response to something outside of Judaism.
So there's no inherent philosophy of Judaism.
Right. That you only have thoughts of Judaism per se, but not thoughts about Judaism. You have Jewish thoughts, like reading the Torah or something, but not reflecting on what is the Torah and why do we have it.
Right.
Because it's inherently in response to the time.
That reflective level of thinking.
depending on the time.
Rambam's one example of that. Anyone want to read number 3, who's going to address this directly?
I'll go ahead.
Great.
And in this sense, Jewish thinking remains apologetic thinking. One did not become a Jewish thinker in the undisturbed circle of Judaism. Here, thinking did not become a thinking about Judaism, which was simply the most self-evident thing of all, more a being than an ism, but rather it became a thinking within Judaism, a learning, thus ultimately not a fundamental, but rather an ornamental thinking. Anyone who was supposed to reflect on Judaism had somehow, if not psychologically, then at least spiritually, to be torn at the border of Judaism. Therefore, however, his thinking was then determined by the power which had led him to the border, and the depth horizon of his gaze was determined by the degree to which he had been carried on or across the border. The apologetic is the legitimate force of this thinking, but also its danger.
Okay, so the first thing we have here is what we were just saying, right? That within the circle of Judaism, there's no thinking about Judaism. There's just learning. The thinking there is just ornamental. What the question is learning. It's Talmud Torah, right?
But isn't it why we're doing what we're doing? Isn't that the more philosophical side of it?
Right. He's saying there's not really a lot of thinking. Why are we doing this? It's more like what are we doing? How are we doing it? When are we doing it?
What's his name? Rosenzweig is saying?
Well, he's going to be drawing two different models of what Jews do, and one of them within the circle of Judaism, and then one is going to be the Rambam model, and that's what I have in bold text here, which is on the borderline. If you think about it in terms of like visual images, Judaism is a circle, or sort of like a sphere that sort of moves through time. And on the inside, there's Jewish thinking, which is not really thinking so much at all. The thinking there is purely ornamental. It's the necessary discussions you have to have in order to know what to do, right? We're finishing up Hanukkah now. You got to know how to light, when to light, what to light, where. But that's all just there in order to help you do things and live your Jewish life. The Jewish life is primarily about just living it.
So the idea of like time and mitzvah would not at all factor in his thinking necessarily.
Right.
It's not relevant.
Yeah, so he thinks those are relevant, but only I think secondary to the act of doing them, and they're not really broad reflective about what is Judaism so much as under small secondary ways of understanding each individual mitzvah. He doesn't have a big theory of mitzvot like Rambam does, right? Rambam was the first person to have all of the mitzvot were given for these 2 or 3 purposes, and part of the Torah's big thing of God's historical plan.
Does he think that think or not think that at the root of discussions within Gemara or halachic discourse there are fundamental philosophies or thoughts that lead them to how we live?
I think that it's not. There's a separation you're saying there about the fundamental philosophy versus that leads us to how we live. So much I think that those he would see as being one thing, that we have a certain way of living that we think is the good way of living, and cheers over there.
There's a chair right here.
And those are really closely tied together, without a lot of precedence being given to the thought. Certainly more precedence given to sort of how you live your life.
And even if there were those things, they never were, as you said, systemized.
Yeah, there's no
together.
really broad reflective system that's you are trying to make. Yes, and then there's the second half of this quote, which I think is pretty important. Anyone who was reflecting was sort of taken by the philosophy of the moment or whatever they encountered to the borderline of Judaism. If we have that image of the Judaism as a circle or sphere traveling through history, these are people who've been brought from the center out to the edge. That you could think of the Jewish community as very literally surrounded by non-Jews and philosophers, and only people who interact with them are going to reflect on what is Judaism on this broad scale. Notably, that definitely includes himself. Like I said, he grew up basically pretty assimilated, already on the margins of the circle, and then was studying history and philosophy in college and talking to religious Christians, and was going to convert to Christianity until he eventually decided to remain Jewish. And he ends up writing lots of reflections on and philosophies of Judaism and things like that. There's also a really powerful letter he has where someone basically asked him, are you more Jewish or are you more German? And I don't remember the exact language, in part because I've read it in English and Hebrew, and they're different translations of the original German. But he basically says something along the lines of, I know that my heart has 2 halves, and I know which side is bigger. He's I know that the Jewish part of me is more important. But I also know that if you tried to make me pick one, I wouldn't survive the surgery. It's a beautiful sort of image. So he's one of these people who lives on the borderline. And he says that this person, the depth horizon of his gaze was determined by the degree to which he had been carried to, on, or across the border. That there's this sort of ambiguous state of living on the borderline that actually enables you to have this deep understanding of Judaism. To the degree that Rambam, even if he's stuck in the past, still offers a compelling vision of Judaism in many ways. It's because he was so able to so deeply tap into things outside of Judaism. That the ability to look at Judaism from the outside is what grants this reflective and systematic view and vision of Judaism. Rav Shagar, who we're going to see in the next half of this year, quotes Rabbi Nachman on this a lot. Rabbi Nachman says that Gerim, converts, bring raise up God's kavod. That the kavod when we are in exile is with the non-Jews, and when people when they convert, they actually bring kavod back. And the Rav Shagar explains that. He says that there people who are born Judaism born Jewish might never think about what makes Judaism good, might take it for granted. People who convert, usually because they found something valuable in Judaism. They're the people who actually thought about what is Judaism, is it something I want, is it not, etc. Thoughts so far? Alright, so before we move on to the second half, we're going to skip number 4. It's not so necessary. Read it if you want. Before we get there, though, how would you define what Rosenzweig depicted as Judaism? If you could place it on the broad spectrum of people who call themselves Jewish today, how would you define sort of Rosenzweig's Judaism?
Tradition.
Tradition.
Meaning not necessarily contemplating it as much as kind of just following it and not.
Okay, so if you could say pick a group of people who consider themselves Jewish today, how do you think that would fit in today's map of Jews? So my thought is that I think, despite the fact that he, once again, is not this, I think he's talking about Haredim. When he was in Germany in the 1910s, he was a volunteer to serve in the German army in World War I. And he ends up in Eastern Europe and encounters Eastern European Jews and has this really powerful experience of I'm from Germany where all the Jews are assimilating. But here there's a really vibrant Jewish life. And that's really what he picks up, and how he understands Judaism is really sort of fundamentally Haredi. And you have the option of living sort of on the borderline, but the core of what it means to be Haredi, or to be Jewish, is to kind of be Haredi.
But he's still interacting, though, with the outside, meaning, how does that work? How I think of a Haredi is somewhat, this is also very sort of generalizing, but they're not necessarily interacting with the outside world, whether it's in academia, and maybe they are, but in academia or secular culture as a whole, he sees value to that. He may not think it's Judaism.
Right, no, so I think that's part of, say, an everlasting tension in his thought, is that if he's right about sort of how Judaism works, he's always marginal. And that's not just in the fun image of living on the outside, that's he's really not part of what's true, intense Judaism. He's always something sort of on the outside. And I think that maybe would make it hard to pick up that model of thought. If you really believe someone when they say that's what Judaism is, then why isn't he doing that? And do we want to affirm that same vision? Okay, so next we're going to move on to Rav Shagar. Rav Shagar was a Dat Leumi rabbi who died in 2007. He lived and in Israel his entire... What? I think just 1 year.
1 year.
But he studied at Yeshiva Keren B'Yavne, and then was in Kollel at Hakotel, eventually became a Ram there. He was teaching, and then Rav Hadari, who was his rabbi, who was Rosh Yeshiva, went on. He unfortunately passed away here recently. He went on sabbatical for a year. So Rav Shagar was acting Rosh Yeshiva for a year, and after that he left. He did a variety of things. He with Rav Steinsaltz and Rav Nachum Fruman, they opened yeshiva in Kor Chaim, which was then a higher level yeshiva. Now is a high school. He was Rosh the Beit Midrash at Ma'aleh, which is a religious film school still open today. He wrote Beit Midrash at Beit Morashah, which has done a lot of interesting stuff on this sort of borderline academic religious stuff. And he eventually opened his own yeshiva that's still open in Givat Hadagan Nefrat, called Yeshivat Siach Yitzchak. And he's best known for a couple of things. One is really introducing Chassidut into religious Zionist learning, not just in an intellectual way. Rav Amital was doing that, Rav Hadari was doing that, but is a really way of being religious and reading Hasidic texts, looking for how did they think about themselves and God and Torah and stuff like that. He was doing that. Rav Fruman was doing that. Now lots of people are doing that. but he was one of the first people for that, in particular Rabbi Nachman and Ishbitz. And then also he's well known for introducing existentialist and postmodern thought into like how he thought about Judaism. Anyone who's talked to me before will know that I don't think the term postmodern is useful for anything at all, but that's what he's known for. And this is part of an essay called On Translation and Living in Multiple Worlds. About this, it was meant for Hanukkah. It was a drasha he gave for Hanukkah, and it's meant, it was discussed as this issue of like, do we live entirely within Judaism? How do we relate to the outside world? What are different ways that Jews do that? So he has his own approach, which is what we're going to look at, but in the essay he also talks about Rav Soloveitchik and Professor Yishai Leibovitz and others. Questions before we get started? Okay. Anyone want to read number 4? I'll jump in. For better or worse, we are citizens of multiple cultures, and we live in more than one world of values. We are not able to deny this situation, nor would we deny it if we could. Denying it would be self-denial, leading to deep radical injury to our religious faith itself. Rabbi Nachman's approach to translation is therefore not only desirable, but also the only option for elevating the translation that's already happening anyway. I see great importance in this characterization because we do not first experience the true problem of the encounter between Torah, religious life, and Greek language, affecting us through media, academia, literature, and much more, when we come across this language in our university studies after years of learning in yeshiva. Rather, much earlier, in the religious education that we received in the foundation of our faith and in the limited constructs that we make its content. We therefore need a substantial religious, spiritual, Jewish alternative, without which it is impossible to avoid internal contradictions that bear a heavy price. Rav Shagar here is talking about what he calls translation, which is the ability to move between languages, but languages in a broader sense. So, like, secular culture can be one language, and Judaism can be one language. You'll talk about, like, Hasidut is one language within Judaism as opposed to Gemara, or, Mishnah is Lefish Judaism. And within...
Musar-Judaism.
Yeah, Musar-Judaism. And he says that we live in multiple worlds. It's just who we are. And he, for him, this is, religious Zionists. That it means to be religious and Zionist is to be, those two things. And that it's not just one thing. He really himself sort of grew up in what he considered a much more kind of Haredi environment. By the time he's teaching students, he's like, no, we live in a world that is composed both of a intense Jewish experience, but simultaneously also a secular experience. And he lived here in Israel, so for him, they're actually both Jewish, but this is just as true of people who grow up in America, where secular culture is American, not necessarily Jewish. And so if Rosenzweig drew this line around what Judaism is, and the line between Judaism and the outside world, around the outside of the sphere, Rav Shagar says it goes right down the middle. There's no clean distinction between Judaism and the outside world because Judaism is part of who we are. When we learn about Judaism, we learn in terms of modern theory, like how modern people understand religion. And a good argument to make, the fact that we use the word religion to define Judaism is because we're very modern. Like Judaism, you read the Torah, doesn't have any sort of distinction between like civil laws and religious laws. It doesn't have a clear sense that like every person in the nation is supposed to have a personal relationship with God, as opposed to like the nation as a whole has a relationship with God. You find more of that kind of stuff in Chazal already, and later in Tanakh, more like personal things. But the fact that we think of like every individual person has their own relationship to God directly is in many ways not just modern but Protestant. And Rav Shagar is saying that it's important for us to understand that like there are different languages at work here, and we have to be able to know how to navigate between them. Otherwise, we're just going to be hopelessly, unconsciously contradictory.
So I have a question. You'll have to forgive me if you addressed this in the first part, but I'm trying to understand. So like the my nafkamina, right? What in what sense is it not purely a semantic or a syntactic question? About whether X is Judaism or not Judaism. Is it a question about, in other words, I can understand a halakhic question, like if you're, let's say that you're a very strong Haredi and you believe that it's also to learn anything that's not Torah, so then it would be anything that's not Judaism you're not allowed to learn. So that has like a halachic nafkamina. But if you're not of that view, so then why does it matter?
Well, there's a couple things. One, you could definitely find more concrete, practical questions. So, arguably, on the Rosenzweig model, you shouldn't study anything we're talking about now. Like, anything you're talking about now is only b'diavad because you've, encountered modern thinking, and you should really try and avoid it and just go study Gemara.
Like, as a prescriptive sort of statement of what you should be doing, he actually thinks that you really should be learning Torah.
What I'm saying is that's part of it's part of the contradiction and tension of the Rosenzweig model, which he doesn't make that prescriptive statement, even though that would seem to be what his descriptions imply. He makes it like what's real Judaism, like Jewish thinking versus apologetic thinking, which he says is good defense, but that all is like even the language of defense and the demands of the occasion are all b'diavad. And so you could make the argument. Another argument is just in terms of self-understanding, reflecting on who you are, so you can, one, understand yourself better, two, think about the decisions you make, why you make them, and do you want to keep making them that way. And for that, considering the range of options presented in reflected philosophical perspective might be valuable.
Right, but I guess, because the other side of it is that it's a question of identity and it's how you feel about yourself. But it's also a general question to me whether that should matter to anyone. In other words, whether it's a valuable thing for people to spend any time thinking about, oh, who am I, which community do I belong to, unless it happens to be that they find themselves bothered by those persistent thoughts. Why don't you just follow halacha and do whatever it is you do?
So I think Rav Shagar is a good example of where he really thinks that making this, making note of this contradiction of who we are, is important because, as he said in the last line here, impossible to avoid contradictions bear a heavy loss. He has specific things in mind when he says that. He talks about this in all kinds of different essays because it's something that bothered him over time. And he thinks that because of the contradictions inherent in religious Zionism and the fact that they're not going addressed directly, things are like, one, people are thinking that it's not a serious, principled movement, and they're becoming Chardal or Haredi. Which is, Haredi religious Zionists and much more right-wing in terms of religion. He has an essay where he says that actually leads to sort of the other pole being strengthened, where people are really leaning into the Zionism in a very militaristic fashion he finds to be dangerous. People are becoming secular and just dropping it all together because they feel like the religious aspect is not serious. And he thinks sometimes people are just maintaining the social form, basically what we call socially orthodox. They're orthoprax. They're going through the moves and the social norms of Orthodox and religious Zionist Judaism without actually believing in it. He thinks all of those are bad things that we could avoid by thinking and making conscious, intentional decisions about who we are and who we want to be as a community. Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
It says a substantial religious, spiritual, Jewish alternative. What is that? That's referring to a community or?
So this is going, and we're going to see in the next piece, this is actually a very individualistic model, but he means as a community, we need to think about what does it mean to be religious Zionists? How do we merge the religious aspects of ourselves with the Zionist aspects? The modern aspects with the Orthodox aspects, and that's all. Not just letting them sort of happen on their own or ignoring it, or but what are the possibilities and what do we mean when we say each of them? All of those are questions he wants us to be asking in order to be able to sort of make a healthy integration of them. Number 5, the multiple split identity model puts together different worlds without recognizing compartmentalized truth values or different realms of truth. We should describe the religious Zionist soul as a soul that lives not in one world but in many worlds, which it likely cannot integrate. It does not compartmentalize them, Torah versus Avodah, faith versus science, religion versus secularism, but rather manages confusing and often even schizophrenic set of relationships between them. A new type of religiosity has therefore developed nowadays, one that cannot be defined by its location on any graph. It's scattered across many different, you could even call them strange centers. This religiosity does not define itself with the regular religious definitions, but enables a weaving of unusual identities, integrating multiple worlds in a way that's not a way. Just briefly, that means a way that's not a sort of broad path that everyone should follow. It presents a deep personal faith that, in my opinion, carries the potential for religious redemption. I was going to note that last line. Religious redemption is not a throwaway line. That's a consistent theme in Rav Shagar's thought. That is something, a way in which he stands against and trying to present a challenge to the religious Zionist community, which he feels often has focused on political redemption at the expense of the religious redemption that he feels that Judaism throughout the ages has dreamt of. Yeah.
What happened?
So broadly, though, he's depicting here one. Whereas in the last piece, he said, "Okay, well, if we don't do this, bad things happen. If we don't do this, people stop being religious Zionists. They become fundamentalists. They become militaristic. They become secular." Here he finds this to be really exciting. There's actually something very powerful he finds in the ability to combine modern values and Torah and avodah, working the land, faith and science. All of those things can actually come together in very powerful and exciting ways.
How does it express itself? Meaning, I always have a hard time, differentiating between, let's say, I know it's different, but Rav Shagar and Rav, so how is this model different from the Torah Umada sort of model?
Yeah, so particularly when it comes to Rav Soloveitchik, a lot of it's going to be a question of interpretation. Conveniently, Rav Shagar gives his interpretation of Rav Soloveitchik, so we know what he thought Rav Soloveitchik was doing. And he essentially thinks, he says this explicitly, that Rav Soloveitchik is largely, not always, but generally a philosophical formulation of a Haredi position. And there's I can't remember what it's called, but there's an article by David Singer and someone else, I can't remember, where they make this kind of argument that reading Halachic Man is really a Haredi position being articulated in philosophical terms, which already itself is qualitatively different than a Haredi position, right? A Haredi person can't put themselves in philosophical terms. But the philosophy doesn't get to the core of who Rav Soloveitchik is on that reading. Philosophy is always external. He's Jewish and occasionally does science and philosophy and whatever.
That's a Rosenzweig model.
Yeah, much more like the Rosenzweig model. Question of how compelling it is. Compelling in some ways. The Rav Soloveitchik wrote the Halachic Mind, which is 3/4 of it is just philosophy stuff. In the last quarter, he gets to Judaism, and I have a hard time imagining anyone who religion, the philosophy doesn't go down to the core of them, would spend all the time building up the philosophical argument.
I don't know. I haven't read Halachic Mind, but I'm not sure that either of those books necessarily really addresses the issue of the Torah Umada relationship. I think that more comes from sort of oral traditions from his students and his involvement with YU. And his writing is sort of more focused on very specific questions. Right, and
that's true. It doesn't address it. That's my own reading, is that I have a hard time imagining someone who's not, at the very least on a very deep level, interested in philosophy, writing Halachic Mind. Because you could present a lot of the arguments in the end without quite the sort of tour de force of philosophy of science and things in the 20th century that he decides to go into. Mm-hmm. But that's, definitely my argument and not...
I didn't read it, so...
There's valid arguments on all sides in Rav Soloveitchik on this one. He was prone to contradicting himself over time. So, but for Rav Shagar, the ability to put these things together is itself a very exciting religious option. And I want to get into some concrete thinking together with you guys about that. But first I want to get into what he sees as the religious justification for that model, because if Rosenzweig is going to argue that Jews have always been this way throughout time, Rav Shagar is also presenting consciously this is how Jews should be thing. At least religious Zionists should be this way. And he's going to present here his argument, which I also brought because it ties it into Hanukkah very nicely. As per Rabbi Nachman, the deep meaning of preserving the covenant, was something Rabbi Nachman talked about a lot, Shmirat Brit, the meaning is eros. This is the significance of the small jug of oil with the seal of the high priest. The harmony of an individual with who and what he is, without locking himself into a specific identity. He can be who he is, whoever that may be. Rav Shagar sees the idea of a brit, of a covenant, as recognizing and embracing who God made you. That you exist at like a specific moment and place in time. In this context, you exist as a religious Zionist or modern Orthodox person in a community that is constituted by both modern and Orthodox and religious and Zionist and secular and Jewish, and just embracing that fact and not trying to deny who God made you. That if the miracle of the jug of oil is that there exists one thing in a specific place where people are able to find it, then that's what it means to embrace your brit with God, is to accept that you are where God put you. The same way the oil was there for them to find. So that's an argument he makes all over the place, and in context here of recognizing who we are, is recognizing a sense of divine providence throughout all of history that led to every single moment. So we should see ourselves as given a sort of guidance by God just by accident of birth. Who we are and where we were born and how we were raised, and the people we encounter are all part of how God made us. And then embracing that and accepting that is part of our covenant with God. And so for him that translates back into what we were talking about recognizing the secular and the religious within our Judaism, and working forward from that without denying it.
Sorry, this last passage has me thoroughly confused. Maybe because from Rabbi Nachman, I don't know that much, but I know that when the guys come around with the pamphlets about Shmirat HaBris, it's about masturbation, right? That's usually what the pamphlets are about. So is that what Rabbi Nachman is that what Rabbi Nachman actually talks about when he's talking about Shmirat HaBrit? Or is he talking about something broader? So what is Rav Nachman actually talking about? How is Rav Shagar interpreting him? And then,
start with the second question. Rav Shagar is always interpreting everyone freely. He's very conscious about that. His interpretations can be loose. But usually there's something he's working off of, and he's not just making stuff up, and Rabbi Nachman's a good example of that. Rabbi Nachman is working off a long Kabbalistic tradition associating the word brit with sexuality and eros. And making that a sort of fundamental sin and fundamental issue, which can also be a source of great blessing. And Rabbi Nachman builds off that and really builds it into a very broad sense, like everything is connected to Shmirat HaBrit. And you could take that in the most narrow sense of sexual purity and like not having improper sexual relations and only having proper sexual relations. And this is somewhat begged by Rabbi Nachman's broad use of it, you can see that it is, at some ways, like, expansive, even if you're not shifting the topics. That's why Rav Shagar doesn't say Brit is just what God made you. Brit is eros, which is something inherently tied into the sort of energy of sexuality. And so that energy of passionate embrace and focus on a single thing, that is read broadly in Rabbi Nachman, and then even more broadly in Rav Shagar.
Okay, so when he says the deep meaning is eros, so is that a negative thing or a positive thing? In other words, that's the avoidance of sexual impropriety, or is he focusing on?
No, like you said, there's a twofold, like two sides of the same coin, and that going through Rabbi Nachman and back to Tikkun Zohar and everything, which is that Shmirat HaBrit is both avoiding sexual impropriety, like improper sexual relations and masturbation and everything, and also engaging in proper sexuality. So the eros here is the proper sexuality.
But it refers to like actual like physical olam hazeh sexuality as opposed to like some sort of erotic, ecstatic engagement with God or something like that.
It means both, going all the way back.
Okay. No, that's legitimate. Okay, so then what's the connection to the Pach Shemen then? And then what's the connection to like Rav Shagar's argument?
Okay, so it's a big broadening away from the specific focus on sexuality to the sort of broader emotional engagement, which once again Rav Shagar is definitely broadening from the somewhat ambiguously broad picture before him, and that's the eros. That the Shmirat HaBrit, engaging and preserving our covenant with God, is about consciously and passionately engaging in what God gave us. The what God gave us aspect is the Pach Hashem, right? And there's two aspects to that. One is, as I was saying, the miracle of like the way God put the oil there and the way the oil works, as well as, and this is part of the negative aspect of it, of avoiding improper relations, is that the oil was pure, right? That's the big deal that's made about the oil, and that big deal is made despite the fact that in technical language, tumahu trabet sibor, when the whole congregation is impure, then you actually don't worry about stuff like, is the oil for the menorah impure? You would just light whatever they had. But that sense of wanting to engage with like pure, undefiled, like oil is that sense of shmirat habrit in the negative sense.
Okay, so I get the connection with purity. So now how does that relate to the overall argument about like identity or not being?
The harmony of an individual with who and what he is. That one.
Yeah.
So that is embracing how God made you. That the result eros of your covenant with God, and this, so perhaps could be argued that like there's not as much of it in these few lines. That I happen to have a wide background in Rav Shagar that would help me know that's what he means here.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's true, I'm sorry. I didn't bring enough, but I can't bring everything in it's here. I'm happy to send you the full essay after class.
Right, because I could read this idea from Rabbi Nachman exactly the opposite. Right, I could read it more like Rosenzweig was reading it. That like no, there's the tameh and there's the tahor, and like Judaism, traditional Judaism is what's tahor, and everything else is what's tameh, and that's the Greeks, right? That's the Greeks coming in to like come and impure the Pach Shemen. So the fact that he's reading it in totally the opposite way to make an opposite art, like the Pach Shemen would have signified to me the exact opposite. Right, because the Pach Shemen is something that's normally tahor because it's in Jewish hands, and then the Greeks come and defile it.
So let's do a little broader context. And the essay this is from. This is from the end of an essay. It's called On Translation and Living in Multiple Worlds. And it's built almost entirely on Rabbi Nachman. He starts off talking about Rav Kook. Rav Kook said, Greek wisdom is great. Greek wisdom is, the contents are wrong, but the tools are excellent. And they'll get us all the right things. And you can use them within Judaism, and it's going to be great. And today that's like, academic study of Talmud, academic study of Tanakh, etc. And Rav Shagar says, I think maybe Rabbi Nachman had it right when he says that the tools of, the non-Jewish world aren't neutral. They actually carry with them ideas and underlying positions. And one of Shagar's favorite examples of this is science is, assumes causation on whatever degree, and you can't really believe in a scientific world and believe in prayer with it, like, naively. You have to recognize there's a contradiction there and try and deal with it. And if you just sort of embrace, causation in science, whatever, that has religious ramifications. And you're the scientist, so that may or may not be right.
If you believe in determinism,
right?
Yeah, causation. Okay, yeah.
But that's so he's like aware. That's the issue he starts from. But then he moves to some other pieces in Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Nachman says that is this idea of Lashon HaKodesh, the holy, pure language, and Lashon Targum, language of translations. And he connects to Eitz HaChaim, Lashon HaKodesh. Eitz HaDat Tov Ra is the translation. And it can be that ambiguous Tov or Ra. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. And he brings in the question of sexuality and Shmirat HaBrit in this very broad sense of what Targum can be involved in. And he actually says, Ikar binyana mishlim mutasha Lashon HaKodesh is Targum, that the ability to translate ideas into Judaism is the essence of building and perfecting the whole, making whole the language of Judaism, the Lashon HaKodesh. It requires raising aspects out of the non-Jewish sort of ambiguous level. That's his reformulation in terms of the language of the Kabbalistic idea of raising up sparks of holiness, that the origin of creation is a shattering of the first divine creations that then leave holiness embedded throughout everything, in mundane, neutral things, but also in deeply religiously problematic things, and impure things, and that part of the broader Kabbalistic ethos that Rabbi Nachman absorbs and that comes into Rav Shagar in this formulation is in fact that there's divinity everywhere within things that are problematic, and to the point where you sometimes It's a question of what makes things problematic and what makes them not problematic. So here, Rav Shagar is saying that this process of translation helps bridge between the different parts of ourselves. And for Rabbi Nachman, that was you can raise up sparks from the impure and the unholy. And for Rav Shagar, who's taking more of a God, everything is divine and godly, and God made us who we are, that enables us to bridge together the different parts of our godly selves.
Does he think that the understanding of what we aren't, meaning the other languages that are, let's say, he would describe himself as he was Dati-Leumi, correct?
Yeah. So
does he say that the greater understanding of, secular Judaism or Haredi or anything like that gives him a greater understanding of who he is? Is that what he's trying to say?
Well, now he's talking internally. He does say that. I mean, right now he's talking about the ability to think about the different parts of who we are. He also sometimes talks about
who we aren't.
Who we aren't. There's an essay published in Luchot Shivrei Luchot, the book of his, on the relationship between Judaism and the West, and the relationship between Judaism and the East. And one of his main points there is the ability to step out. Basically, the Rosenzweig argument. The ability to sort of step outside of Judaism can be very helpful in understanding who we are. And he says there, what we should mainly do is try and understand what other people are, in order to contrast, even if there are, say, Jewish and, broadly speaking, Eastern versions of meditation, what's unique about each one. So we understand what's unique about Jewish meditation by contrast.
Well, that actually, you can see that with a lot of, let's say, Balei Tshuva, who didn't necessarily grow up in the system or grow up in this, internal, sphere that you were talking about, but they were able to kind of go from the outside, and it seems like he's kind of going from the inside out.
So that's, I mentioned that back in the Rosenzweig model. Rav Shagar likes to talk about the idea that Balei Tshuva or Karmatzer bring more of a sense of reflection and outside perspective that enables you to better understand Judaism. Rav Shagar is basically arguing that we both do and should do that automatically. And like I was saying, that we think about Judaism in terms of our inner relationship with God and external mitzvot and stuff that are just broader categories of religion outside of
constant contemplating.
Yeah. Any thoughts and questions so far, comments? I wanted to take it to a couple of practical examples that I think are helpful for thinking through this. Write them down here somewhere. So one question was, I don't know if everyone here is a citizen of the state of Israel, but for those who are, we had mayoral elections recently. So one question that's worth thinking about is, to what degree did religion and Judaism play a role in your voting or not voting for the political, for the elections? Did you consider it before voting? If you voted, did you say what's best for Judaism in the state? Do you say what did my rabbi want me to do? Personally, I could say that I actually strongly believe in, on a religious level, it's separating between religion and state. So there's a complex interplay here of, I religiously decided not to vote based on religion. Anyone else want to share? No pressure. Anyone have any thoughts of, how religion affected your vote?
By definition, you live in a Jewish state. There is no separation of religious and state here. So I think, by definition, living here and voting, you are religious. It's a religious vote.
Right, but would you say you weighed any sort of religious issues involved in the voting process?
So I would also say a political stance is also a religious stance.
Okay, that makes sense. If you believe that there's inherent religious value in the state, then however you want that state to look, even if it doesn't involve explicit religious values, is itself a religious position.
Yes.
Toby.
I didn't even raise my hand.
I can see it in your eyes.
But so in my context of secular friends and colleagues, they pretty much all said very explicitly, we can't vote for the religious guy. There's an obvious choice here. There's one guy who isn't wearing a kippah, and he's the guy that we have to vote for. And I understand them completely because they don't want kfiyat datit. And I think that from their perspective, it's a valid approach. I am a little bit more sympathetic to religion, but ultimately, I'm also afraid of kfiyat datit. So yeah, it was Dav guy wanted the secular guy to win.
There's a very interesting article that was written in the middle of I don't know, really maybe a little before the mayor elections. I don't know. There've been campaign posters up for 4 years. I wouldn't know what's happening. But it was a couple of Israeli secular public leaders who wrote a open letter to American Judaism saying, if you want there to be more liberal Judaism if you want Israel to be more liberal in the broadest sense, stop trying to bring liberal Judaism, because the Israeli Chiloni sector writ large doesn't you're either Haredi or Chiloni. There's not a whole lot of in between space, if any.
The synagogue I don't go to is Orthodox.
Yeah, and they really don't want to go there.
And I remember that debate. I remember that article, and it's no, you don't understand. There has to be a place for religious people who aren't crazy to go, because then they have to choose between being secular and being Haredi.
Anyone else? Okay. And then the second question I had, I think is valuable thinking about it, is the question of academic studies. More broadly, it could be scientific studies or humanities and things. I've been in college for 6 years now or something, and that is a really broad question of should religious Jews be going to college, and to what degree in religious schools should they be teaching academic normal general secular studies and things. And the questions go both ways there. I mean, on a religious level, what do you think about actively pursuing academic studies and general secular studies, and to what degree does your academic view filter into your understanding of Judaism? And like I say, I did my bachelor's degree at Michelot Herzog in Gush Etzion. It's one of the leading, if not the leading, academic institution and religious institution for studying Tanakh in Israel. And it was an accident that I studied Tanakh there. I wanted to go study Jewish philosophy. They said, actually, you have to take 2 majors. So I heavily debated what my second major would be. The registrar really tried to convince me to teach English. And that's because it's just much easier to get a job teaching English. As I found out over the course of studying there, it's not always easy to get a job teaching Tanakh. It's impossible to get a job teaching Jewish philosophy. There are almost no Jewish high schools in Israel religious high schools that teach Jewish philosophy anymore. It's just not a thing. So it's a good thing I don't plan on teaching in high school. But I also remember speaking to a teacher about what about teaching English? What do you think about that? And he said he studied there too, and he just went. They didn't do double majors at his point in time, but he had thought about teaching English. He was American. It's easy to do. It's very desirable. But he ultimately said he wants to be a religious educator. If he was teaching English, it would mean he had failed on a religious level. And so I went and studied Tanakh instead. And I suddenly encountered all of biblical criticism. They don't teach it there, but they it was around the periphery of what I was studying, and they have a great library, and I spent a lot of time suddenly opening up to how I understand Tanakh. And for all my places where I disagree with all kinds of the various distinctions in schools and biblical criticism, how I understand Tanakh is very much through lenses of academic study, and that's how they do it there. You'll have a great class there on Tanakh and the ancient Near East, and the ways that Tanakh is similar to other myths from the ancient Near East, and the way it's different, and using that as a lens, and the idea of thinking of Tanakh as our God-given story, the way they have God-given stories, and things or they have their stories that they see as God-given. That's all a way that academic study has shaped my Judaism. I have a totally different way of seeing parts of my Judaism based on that now. So once again, no pressure. But anyone have any sort of thoughts on either one of those 2 questions? One, religious perspectives on whether or not or how much or whatever for studying academic things, or ways in which academia, science, etc. has affected how you see Judaism.
I don't think there's one right answer for anybody. I think that idea of the media, sort of the medium is the message that we sort of talked about before. How academic methods aren't necessarily neutral. I think that's something important for educators to keep in mind, but also for some people that could really, academic study of Tanakh, that could really enrich a lot of people. So I think it's actually really interesting to sort of examine those models, but for other people, I think it's sort of hard to live with those tensions, and I don't know. I'm not sure there's one right answer.
There's a risk you might go off the derech like I did.
No, that's
Because of biblical criticism?
Yeah, it was largely due to that. I studied that way. I mean, it was that and the Jewish history and philosophy and some other things, but yeah, a big part of it was the Bible stuff.
And there's a good argument to be made for that. With Rav
For going
Shagar,
off the derech.
no, for considering it a risk and then deciding that maybe it's too risky. Rav Shagar had students who stopped being religious, and some of them said, like, even if he didn't tell me to go like in this direction, it wasn't that far of an extrapolation from like the way he was teaching. And a lot of some of his students helped create Yeshivat Oatmeal, which has some similar issues. Like a lot of kids become non-religious. I don't know how well it's accurate, but that is something that people say. But also, it comes with what Rav Shagar considers to be like vibrant religiosity.
Yeah. Well, I think that to the extent that I support religious education, the only form that I would be support is the form which is really honest about the truth. So if there are other opinions that have value, or other opinions, or other ways of looking at the Torah, like you said, in the ancient Near Eastern context, like if you're going to be an honest educator, you don't have a choice but to teach the truth, and then whatever conclusions your students come to, they come to.
Right. I mean, I like take a step beyond that. And like, what if you consider honesty a religious value? And part of what Rav Shagar is building off of is a strong sense of like God made the world as it is. We shouldn't be denying what God did and like the way things are. And so you have to be honest about Judaism, about history, about the world, in order to be at all like properly religious. You want to like encounter God in the fullest sense, that requires honesty.
So how does he feel about religious people? Like, are we cool? How does Rav Shagar feel about irreligious people?
Well, let's say irreligious Jews.
Yeah, sure, irreligious Jews.
He would at once be sad because he clearly thought that like Judaism was right and meaningful and powerful and whatever, but also understanding. And he would never. He was not be of the camp that like either we should mourn you like pretend you died, or consider you to have only gone off following your taivas. That there can be a real search for truth that leads you outside of Judaism, even if you wouldn't go there and be sad that you went there.
Does he hold that there is religious redemption, quote unquote, that can be found in irreligious people too? In other words, that there is a sense in which they are living like a valid Jewish lifestyle.
There requires several layers of histagut, but he doesn't make a positive or negative statement on that context. He doesn't, on the whole, make statements about Judaism outside of Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a couple of statements where he's in various forms rejecting non-Orthodox Judaism. Interestingly, both of them made it into the recent translation that was put out. But the best example is one where he says that, look, one, I think Judaism is just entirely focused on tradition, and he doesn't think anyone but Orthodoxy really follows tradition properly. And then he says that, look, I don't get to define what Judaism is. All I can say is other forms of Judaism don't create Jewish people the way I think Jewish people should be. But I don't get to that's all I can say.
Mm-hmm.
So we're a little more over an hour since I got started. I don't want to hold people too long. I want to sort of summarize. We've seen a couple models here. One is the Rosenzweig model, which seems to suggest that real Judaism doesn't think about what Judaism is. It's just busy doing Judaism, learning what you need to learn in order to live Judaism, raising a Jewish family, carrying forward Judaism. And to the degree that you're reflecting on Judaism, it's because you kind of got stuck in the moment. You got caught up with sort of outside trends, and you're using them to help you understand your Judaism. It doesn't make sort of positive or negative statements, but it feels like maybe the right thing to be doing is to be on the inside of the circle instead of the outside. And there's the Rav Shagar model, where he really thinks that we are all put together from different, contradictory worlds, and that understanding our place in the world, understanding how God wants us to live, involves recognizing those. And in order to create a really powerful Judaism, it means recognizing the different elements of those and integrating them consciously. And I think that is sort of how Rav Shagar takes the broad trend of Hanukkah, is that to whatever degree we have a distinction between Judaism and the outside world, it involves recognizing who we are and being who God made us consciously, as opposed to sort of just violently rejecting everything that doesn't come stamped with a hechsher. Any thoughts or questions? Thank you again to Babayit and Yifat for setting up. Okay. Oh, also, John Hashem, I'll be doing probably a once a month class on Rav Shagar and associated stuff here. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on Facebook for that.
Do you have